My name is Laura. 6 months ago, I married my high school sweetheart, Matt. We'd known each other since we were kids, so I've always been close to his family. That made getting married a breeze. We share a lot of mutual friends, so our wedding was a joyful occasion with lots of well-wishers. I vowed to stand by Matt for the rest of our lives. A few months after tying the knot, I found out I was pregnant. I was on cloud 9. But the blessings didn't stop there. Matt's mom was incredibly supportive, helping us out almost every day. We'd been living with Matt's parents since we got married. Matt is an only child and was raised with a lot of love and care. So, when we decided to get married, living with his parents seemed like the natural choice. I had no issues with it, so I agreed right away. From the day after our wedding, I enjoyed doing household chores with my mother-in-law and chatting about various things. When I announced my pregnancy, she cried tears of joy, as if it were her own good news. Whenever I tried to do something around the house, she'd say, "Don't worry, Laura, I've got this," and take over. "I'm feeling fine today, really." But she'd insist, "You have to think of the baby first, rest up," and stopped me from doing anything. I appreciated her concern, but it got to the point where I was bored out of my mind. I had been working part-time, but I quit my job as soon as I found out I was pregnant, on the advice of both my mother-in-law and Matt. So with nothing to do at home, I was going stir-crazy. I feel like moving around a bit. Can I go shopping? Need anything?" She'd say, "Absolutely not. You're not even in your second trimester yet. You need to rest," and wouldn't let me leave the house. I understood she was concerned for me, but it was suffocating. She had a miscarriage before she was pregnant with Matt because she continued working, so she was worried I'd end up the same way. "If you're not careful, you'll end up in the hospital like I did," she'd warn me. I didn't want to create tension, so I decided to take it easy until my second trimester. Once I reached that milestone, she started allowing me short walks. Matt and I would go out on his days off. We'd buy some snacks from a local store and have a little picnic. Or sometimes I'd go for a walk with my mother-in-law while shopping. She even started cooking with me again. I realized she was just concerned for me during the early stages of my pregnancy. Then, at 38 weeks, my water broke while I was climbing the stairs at home. Matt and my father-in-law were at work, so my mother-in-law drove me to the hospital. Matt had already coordinated everything with the hospital, so by the time Brian was born, he was right there with us. First, Matt held Brian in his arms. "Oh, he's so adorable," Matt said, his eyes welling up with tears as he lovingly looked at Brian. Seeing him like that made me tear up too. "Thank you, Laura. I'm so happy right now," Matt said, smiling at me, and I couldn't help but cry. "May I come in?" My mother-in-law, who had kindly stepped out of the room, peeked her head in. "Go ahead and hold him, Mom. He's really cute." Matt handed Brian over to her. I felt a bit awkward. My mother-in-law had been so supportive and was eagerly awaiting her grandchild. What would she say now that Brian was here? The thought made me anxious. "Thanks to you, we were able to have Brian safely. Thank you so much." When I said that to her, she blurted out something unexpected. "He doesn't look like him." "What?" I had to ask her to repeat herself. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't look like Matt. Are you sure he's Matt's child?" What was she talking about? This should be a happy time, but my heart was racing uncontrollably. "What are you saying?" Matt immediately confronted her, but she continued without apologizing. "Look at the baby pictures of Matt. Brian doesn't look like him at all." She showed us a baby picture of Matt on her phone. "Well, they don't have to look exactly alike." Before I could finish, she stormed out of the room, saying, "I can't deal with a child whose parentage is in question." "Hey, Mom." Matt followed her out, leaving me alone. I looked at Brian's face and started to cry. He looked so much like Matt, especially around the eyes and ears. Matt never returned to the room, only texting me, saying he was going home with his mom. I couldn't believe his behavior, but I was too exhausted to confront him. A few days later, on the day of my discharge, Matt came to pick me up, but seemed down. "What's wrong? We get to live together starting today," I said, but he didn't look happy. "Mom's still upset. Try not to provoke her." I just gave birth and am mentally and physically exhausted. Why do I have to be considerate of her on the day I'm discharged? I didn't say anything to Matt, and the ride home was silent. The tension didn't ease up even after we got home. In fact, as soon as I got home, my mother-in-law said to me, "Oh, you're back?" I was treated with such sarcasm. My father-in-law avoided eye contact, and my mother-in-law made snide remarks. "I've told you many times this child is Matt's. His name is Brian. Won't you please love him?" But she ignored me completely. "Say something, Matt," I cried to Matt, but he coldly said, "Well, it's true. He doesn't look like me." At that moment, my tears stopped. Matt, who should have been on my side, had abandoned me. Looking back, Matt should have stood up to his mother that day. But in the end, he sided with her. I felt empty and gave up on the idea of my mother-in-law ever loving Brian. Matt wasn't helping with childcare either, and my stress kept piling up. "Can you feed him formula while I take a shower?" When I asked, Matt said, "I've been working all day. Why should I lose sleep over a child who might not even be mine?" I can't believe this. Never mind. I fed Brian the formula myself and took a quick shower as soon as he fell asleep. That was my life. If it had only been my mother-in-law, I would have gotten a DNA test to prove her wrong. But even Matt didn't believe Brian was his. That hurt more than anything. My parents had moved to the countryside, so I couldn't rely on them. My parents, who originally wanted to live in a place rich in nature, moved away soon after I got married, so I couldn't rely on them right away. They had been so happy about my marriage and trusted Matt. They loved Matt as if he was their own child. That's why I couldn't tell them what was happening. After months of this, my mother-in-law, who had been ignoring me, finally spoke. "Laura, can you bring the baby to the living room?" "All right." My mother-in-law had been ignoring me and not paying any attention to Brian. I thought she was going to apologize. However, my expectations were quickly dashed. When I got to the living room, both she and Matt were sitting there. "Could you please leave with that child?" "What?" I was stunned and couldn't find the words. She looked at Brian and said, "He still doesn't look like him. I've had enough." Matt said nothing. At that point, I didn't care anymore. "Fine, if that's how you feel. I'll pack my things and leave," I said, signing the divorce papers and started packing. Matt said nothing and continued chatting with his mother. "Make sure you pay child support." "How can we, when we're not even sure he's Matt's?" my mother-in-law retorted. I was so angry, I left without another word and went to my parents' house. I explained everything, and although they were initially confused, they welcomed me. I decided to stay with them until I found a job and save some money. I, of course, had requested child support for my ex-husband through a lawyer, but the money was never transferred. I myself didn't want to have anything to do with my ex or his parents anymore, so I never pressed the issue of the unpaid child support. Years passed. Brian was about 6 years old. I got a call from a local friend who also knew Matt, informing me that Matt had died in a car accident. Of course, I heard about it right after it happened, but I didn't want to get involved, and Brian was going through a busy, active phase, so we didn't attend the funeral. Months later, I happened to be meeting up with local friends and returned to my hometown for the first time in years. Before going to my friend's house, I decided to buy a gift, so Brian and I went to a department store we used to visit as a family. "Laura?" I turned around to see my mother-in-law, whom I hadn't seen in years. As I stood there stunned, she quickly approached us and said, "You're Brian, right?" and started talking to Brian. "Brian, I'm your grandma. You really look just like Matt." My mother-in-law said that. I couldn't stand hearing her say that. "Enough is enough. Because of you, we—" As I said this, she interrupted. "Don't be so angry. I've wanted to see you for so long." Feeling like I was about to yell, I said, "Excuse us," and pulled Brian away, leaving the scene. "Was that Grandma?" Brian asked. I had kept it a secret until now, but Brian, now in elementary school, was genuinely curious and kept asking. "Isn't Grandma supposed to be your mom? Who was that lady?" I couldn't hide it any longer, so I explained it to Brian in simple terms when we got home. Brian said, "Mama, you've been through a lot, huh?" and patted my head. Tears flowed at his kindness. I felt grateful from the bottom of my heart for having him. Months later, my mother-in-law showed up at the apartment where Brian and I were living. "How did you find this place?" When I asked, she said, "I asked around, Matt and your mutual friends. I finally found you," and forced her way in. "Please leave." As I said this, she exclaimed, "Matt died in an accident, and my husband died of illness. You two are all the family I have left." Brian came out of the next room, perhaps hearing my mother-in-law's loud voice. Seeing Brian, my mother-in-law said, "Brian, why don't you come live with Grandma? I have a bigger house and can feed you lots of delicious food." "Stop it!" As I said this, my mother-in-law pulled out a thick envelope. "It has $50,000 for child support. You two are all the family I have left, so please come live with me." She pushed the envelope toward me. Then she turned to Brian and said, "Brian, Grandma wants to live with you. I'll buy you anything you want, okay?" and smiled. In that moment, I felt like crying. I was torn between the feeling of, why now? And wondering if it was okay to deprive Brian of one more grandmother. I was at a loss for words. Then Brian said, "I'm not going." "Huh?" My mother-in-law let out a baffled sound at Brian's words. "Brian, what are you saying? You can live with Grandma, you know. There'll be lots of delicious food, and I'll buy you toys." My mother-in-law tried desperately to persuade him. "I don't want to. You were mean to Mama, right? My only grandma is Mommy's mom." Saying this, Brian shook off my mother-in-law's hand and sat next to me. My mother-in-law fell silent, looking as if she'd lost all hope. After staring at us for a moment, she abruptly stood up and left the house without a word. We haven't heard from her since that day. Of course, she never came to visit us either. The child support money she left behind is being saved for Brian, untouched to this day. When I consulted my parents about whether to return the money, they said, "You never received child support before, so it's fine to keep it." And so I decided to keep it. I don't know what's become of my mother-in-law since then, but honestly, it doesn't matter to me now. Because I have Brian, who's so strong and stands by me. Brian, who protected me from my mother-in-law even at his young age. Brian, who chose me over my mother-in-law's sweet temptations. I love him from the bottom of my heart. I want to continue raising him responsibly, ensuring his happiness, even without